thank you. I'll talk a little slower than I normally do then, okay?
Thank you.
So in this talk, I want to share with you some of the thornier problems and challenges, as well as joys, of negotiating creative practice in today's academic environment from the perspective I know and work in at Goldsmiths, University of London. Now, as a theatre and performance specialist, I will contextualise my thinking in a brief history of drama departments in the UK and their shift in the last 20 or so years to embrace performance studies. I will consider how this has affected pedagogic design and delivery, and finally discuss these themes within the overarching consideration of being a research-intensive institution and what this means in the UK today. So first, I'm so grateful to Ludmilla for inviting me to give this keynote to you, and it's given us the opportunity to meet and develop this exciting project. But also today, it's given me opportunity to reflect on the journey it's been for the development of our theatre discipline in the UK. And for me personally, I'm in my third age now, and what I'm discussing, I find when I reflect, has corresponded in its timelines to my own career story. So much has changed, from issues of inclusion of women and more slowly Black and minority ethnic groups into the academy. We've just appointed our first Black female professor yesterday in Goldsmiths. To issues of discipline, such as the shift from drama to performance, from thinking of theatre as literature to thinking of performance as a term that can be applied to a wide range of behaviours and societal spectacles, large and small. So my title comes from a book, Drama in a World of Science, by a significant Englishman in the field, Glyn Wickham. Wickham was appointed in 1948 to the very first UK drama department at Bristol University. His book, based on some of his lectures on the insertion of drama into higher education at the time, is less concerned with science itself and more with that of university and the role of the drama department at the time, which was 1962. Not surprisingly, his focus was on the production of dramatists, directors and productions, and how a university degree might differ from a conservatoire to shape the theatre makers of the future. I was one of his undergraduates from 1972 to 1975. I was educated in theatre history, play text analysis, some film critique, some acting and directing practice. The second semantic detail in my title is the word ephemeral, that I first understood reading Peter Brook's seminal book, The Empty Space, in 1971. I was working as his assistant translator in Paris at the time, a naive ex-royal ballet dancer entering the mystifying and thrilling world of theatre. That the art form is ephemeral, as Brooke asserts, is its strength to celebrate. It's also its fragility and vulnerability in today's market economy. So in brief, here I'm adapting Wickham's title to speak of ephemeral practice in a world of science, to argue for its value and precisely its vulnerability in a world that seeks to instrumentalize and commodify knowledge and culture, and whose accountability tools lay a false science on top of the more slippery truths of creative research, thinking and practice. Goldsmiths, University of London, where I've worked for almost 20 years, prides itself on our pioneering work in asserting creative practices in the UK. We nurtured the YBA movement, that's the young British artists, emerging from post-punk Margaret Thatcher's London, including the world-renowned Damien Hirst. Can you all hear me? The screen has changed.
Yeah, we can, but what do you mean? Are you sharing a presentation, Anna?
No, I'm just talking to you.
So that's fine. We can see you and hear you.
Great, I'll continue. I'm sorry, my doorbell sometimes goes off randomly, we just ignore. When I joined the department at the cusp of the new millennium, we were in the top 50 list of Prime Minister Tony Blair's Cool Britannia. Tourists would be seen around the campus taking photographs of our zany student population and their definitely non-corporate style. Among many of our reputational traits has been our championing of practice-based PhDs and interdisciplinary research, which I'll return to. But first, let's look at briefly the changing landscape of university theatre and performance provision in the UK in the last decades. It might have resonances with fine art and design and so on as well. In the 1980s began a process of accrediting a range of non-university further education colleges, including vocational drama schools. So now in the UK, we have degrees in performing arts within conservatoires. Some of these have begun to identify themselves research institutions and provide also master's and PhD programs. Now, university drama departments that expanded in the second half of the 20th century have asserted their research-led teaching environments, which offer students a broader intellectual formation, often in tandem with practical study, and in the context of multidisciplinary and multicultural university campuses. This gradually progressed towards innovative thinking about what studying theatre in an academic context might actually mean, how the study of theatre in the broadest sense could be delivered in challenging ways and be porous to, for example, the emergence of cultural studies in the late 1970s, an assertive interdisciplinary project that has shaped so much intellectual development since the legendary Jamaican-born Professor Stuart Hall pioneered the Centre for Cultural Studies at Birmingham University. This has unquestionably influenced theatrical research, but in discipline-specific terms, the largest debt owed to an expanding definition of theatre studies is to Richard Schechner, the New York director and academic whose pivotal influence on the shift from the study of theatre as dramatic literatures to performance studies has been active and consistent. The co-authors of the recent book, The Rise of Performance Studies, James Harding and Cindy Rosenthal, propose how over the last quarter century, an increasingly complex understanding of theatrical practice has encouraged the kind of re-theorizing of performance as a concept that has given rise to performance studies as a distinct area of cultural inquiry. Now, this paradigm shift was in turn indebted to the theories of sociologist Irving Goffman, whose influential proposal on the dramaturgy of social relations introduced the notion of the presentation of self in everyday life, the title of his groundbreaking book, first published in 1956. Here, unusually for theatre in a world of science, social sciences in this case, theatre itself was used as a model by which to propose a sociological perspective on the performativity of every human interaction, how individuals fix, model, and design our presence in the world, suggesting that it is precisely that we are social beings that means we are actors in every sense, adapting to environments in which we play out our existence according to shifting sets of codes and conventions. Today, the online encounter afforded by technology, I'm performing my talk to you and you're performing the receivers, and we will all behave according to the codes and conventions of this online platform. I tend to start all my teaching with alerting students to our interactive performativity in the moment of the teacher-student relationship. This begins a journey of looking at the world around as something to interpret and not simply take for granted. It offers the possibility of comprehending non-absolute truths, of looking at the world semiotically. The screen's gone again. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, it keeps disappearing. The analysis of how, am I going too fast? Is this the right pace?
I think so, yes. Okay. If there is a problem, just...
Please say, stop me if I'm going too fast. The analysis of how power itself is expressed in social dramaturgies is on the agenda. In this potent performance studies crucible, we find ideas stemming from linguistics, such as semiotics, from philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and psychology, from gender studies and post-colonial theory. We find ourselves in a new space where meaning and meaning-making, topic and inquiry, drama and the dramatic are shaken and stirred into a potent cerebral cocktail. While some of my colleagues cling steadfast to drama, understandably, of course it has an important place, the very word performance, when allied with the word study, has produced an elastic revolution in interdisciplinary thinking and praxis. Performance studies is now a sui generis discipline, applied in visual cultures as in theatre and performance departments and beyond. As the above authors note, it constitutes nothing short of a re-theorizing of the very concept of what performing means, not only as arts practice, but as human interactivity, delivering unprecedented intellectual freedom to explore some fascinating interstices between life itself and art. Above all, performance studies suggests a democratizing of knowledge and breaks down the authority of the canon, suggesting rhizomatic knowledges that create what Deleuze and Guattari have called a felt, pressed together thinking, rather than the striated and consequently hierarchical forms of intellectual authority. This, of course, has been of special benefit to liberation movements of gender, race, and class. I have to comment here that it is no coincidence that performance studies should have arisen and been driven by American intellectuals. The American university system allows for interdisciplinarity across an undergraduate curriculum. I myself have taught chemists and mathematicians on my sabbaticals at Princeton. This has produced a vanguard of pioneering scholars possessing flair and energy, who write with depth and breadth, and above all, interdisciplinary confidence, who harness other fields than their own specialism into their thinking. Slower to catch up, we certainly owe a debt here in the UK. The burgeoning of critical performance literature produced in the past 20 years has been forged by those moulded in the liberating vibrancy of the new performance studies climate. When I first entered higher education full-time just over 20 years ago, coming from the theatrical profession, it was striking how many new ideas were buzzing about and being published, many of which had not at the time shaped practitioners, but have evidently done so since. There is a noticeable effect of the university degree that has included performance studies on a new generation of artists and their preoccupations. The term post-dramatic, coined by Hans-Thies Lehmann in his 2008 book, captured the rise of performance over drama and plays since the European avant-garde, producing a new reference point for works devised against tradition in new, often horizontal and collective structures of production, insisted upon by young artists hungry for new paradigms and processes by which to articulate their reality, and young audiences equally keen to see their class and cultural experience reflected in these new vocabularies. In short, post-dramatic terminology supports understanding of experimental creative production methodologies, whilst performance studies leads to unexpected intellectual adventures around the broad topic of performance itself. I note the fascinating and eclectic topics of our PhD students, coming to us from all parts of today's globalized world, each decidedly non-dramatic literature-based researches. My own research interests, following a profoundly life-changing encounter with reproductive intervention 25 years ago, has taken me on a journey into exploring the braiding of performance and medicine. My new master's theory course this spring attracted 21 international students who've written papers on topics as broad as vampires and venereal disease, the executioner and their relationship with anatomy since the guillotine, plague and HIV/AIDS, and Southeast Asian martial practices during pandemia. My book for Routledge, published this week, examines 4 types of hysteria from the 19th century to contemporary eating disorders, taking in World War I shell shock en route, and has drawn on medical history and cultural theory more than literary criticism. The point I'm making is simply that performance studies, located in a theatre department such as the one I work in, expands consciousness towards new ways of comprehending and interpreting Goffman's generative ideas on everyday life dramaturgies. So I'll now turn briefly to curricula and how performance studies has influenced these. To give you just one example of our undergraduate curriculum, for some years I led a first-year praxis foundation module called Space, Body, Spectator. We examined the meaning of these terms, each word turned into a cluster of meanings. Space would look at architecture and public spaces, proxemics and movement, and even consider our concept of interior bodily space. Spectatorship explored audience as cultural and anthropological phenomenon, and the writings of Walter Benjamin, Guy Debord, Jean Baudrillard, and other analysts of the spectacular and the representational in mass media society. The body was very rooted in the ideas of Bakhtin. From such an inquiry, students would make their own performances for theatre and sites and write reflectively on such projects. My master's programme in performance making stubbornly resists defining in any fixed terms what performance actually is today. Eschewing a house style, my students are attracted to this intergenerational program, international and intergenerational program, to find their voice as live practitioners in a hybrid field of creative practice and theoretical study. They're noticeably socially and politically committed to interrogate their own society. Their performances can take many forms. 2 years ago, the annual prize was awarded to 2 women whose final show involved the painstaking preparation, archiving, and live practice of climbing a very high tree with full harnessing and necessary equipment, an expert standing by in full view of spectators behind a large glass window. What was pertinent, and that one discovered in their archive materials, is that their terror of this accomplishment. Both had serious vertigo. Thus, it wasn't just the performance of what a tree surgeon executes in their profession, but a very personal triumph over fear, physical weakness, and unwomanly behaviors, added to which was the investigation of ownership and control of such trees in public spaces and processes of access and permission. Such works will fill a festival that will also include theatre, dance, and performance art practices. My applicants are increasingly familiar with the premise that performance is today an eclectic field of inquiry, and that their careers might embrace presenting their compositions in festivals, to creating projects with marginalized communities, to pragmatic conceptual works of live art, that is authentic non-representational conceptual practice, to interactive online experiments, the latter, of course, obligatory this year. Turning now to the specific challenges of supervising creative practice PhDs, this remains a movable feast of possibility, harnessed to basic ground rules. At Goldsmiths, one of the pioneering institutions to offer practice-based PhDs, as well as those by publication, I'm currently supervising the last of these, our regulations establish that the word length would normally not exceed 50,000, and we would expect at least 30,000 words. The rest is left to the candidate to design a research topic in which the theory speaks to the practice and vice versa. This is not always as obvious as it might sound. I have experience of a brilliant, renowned choreographer, dyslexic and not writing in their first language, straining so hard at first attempt that he wrote a 70,000-word thesis. The examiners declared his practice the best they'd ever seen and failed him. They said his writing did nothing to illuminate or interrelate coherently with the practice. Distraught, he went away for a year, appealed, regained his confidence, and eventually rewrote the thesis. His new panel of examiners loved this, but advised further cutting. What they said to him in the exam is they wanted his artist voice. Finding this both a paradox and a comfort after a decade of scholarly research, he delivered. He passed. He'd gone through many hoops. He'd encountered some of the more elusive aspects of supervising and examining PhD by practice. His successful thesis is now an expanding global training program. I also supervise now a thesis on the maternal body by a dancer who, initially terrified of theory, has got so swept up in her theoretical investigations, now an extraordinary set of intellectual ramifications surrounding the contemporary reproductive body, gender identity and rights, that she's forgotten how to practice. Such tricky conundrums are part of the often uncharted territory of embarking on a practice PhD where there is no one size fits all, only a set of academic frameworks and codes of practice to negotiate. I hope that these 2 examples signal that the relationship between theory and practice is adaptable and cannot follow an orthodoxy of praxis. It will depend on the project. There are many challenges. Not least, the mind that is ready for creative research is not the same as the one that is ready to write analytically. Different parts of the brain are being employed, and finding a seamless approach is 90% of the job. What's the time structure going to be? What comes first, chickens or eggs? How do we do and speak and the doing at the same time? How do we articulate heuristics? There is an array of approaches to writing practice or about practice. Some students necessarily need to explain in infinite detail the experiential embodied discoveries of practical exercises or performance tasks. Painstaking to read, they're nonetheless an essential ingredient in exploring a phenomenological approach to the lived body in live practice. So we're grateful to Merleau-Ponty, who provides philosophical tools by which to handle material that can otherwise be anecdotal and even solipsistic. It's all part of the quest for new knowledge. I meanwhile remain humbled by artists who've written so eloquently and influentially on their work, and would cite here Steve Paxton, the pioneering founder of contact improvisation and a master at words, and his contemporary, New York Judson Church postmodern choreographer and filmmaker, the doyenne Yvonne Rainer, whose 1965 No Manifesto has defined the commitment to non-representational performance for some decades. I think it worth quoting as a seminal text. No to spectacle, no to virtuosity, no to transformations and magic and make-believe, no to the glamour and transcendency of the star image, no to the heroic, no to the anti-heroic, no to trash imagery, no to involvement of performer or spectator, no to style, no to camp, no to seduction of spectator by the wiles of the performer, no to eccentricity, no to moving or being moved. It's precisely in the sphere of representation or not, or let's say the theatrical act of transformation and make-believe, pretending to be another in short, as opposed to the performance of authenticity, the Goffman everyday self as it were, that divides the theatre's drama sector from the performance studies referencing sector. Today, they sneak up on each other, borrow and steal, but for a long time their clear distinction held sway. I've defined my own master's program as this. In theatre, people are performing their relationship with each other, but in performance, they're performing their relationship to the world. It's simplistic, but helps explain the psychological versus conceptual divide. Now, all of the above considerations, from pedagogy and curriculum to doctoral research, are overarched by what is understood as constituting research in higher education in the UK. Goldsmith's research academics are contracted not only to deliver pedagogy from our research, but to spend, in theory, 40% of our working lives producing such. We rarely get the 40%, by the way. The UK's Research Excellence Framework, I'm going to call it the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, REF, is a national audit that takes place every 6 years and grades each university in a public league table. It affects university income from central government. REF defines research, and I quote, as a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. We're asked to grade research of all types: books, articles, journals, projects, and creative practice. To achieve 4 stars, which is the top, you need to prove that your research is world leading. There's much emphasis on international significance. A department's outputs are submitted to external panels who scrutinize our own evaluations according to theirs. The REF has also more recently introduced a new category that produces 25% of the final grade: impact. Impact is defined, I quote, an effect on, change, or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment, or quality of life beyond academia. So essentially, this is an explanation of where the taxpayers' money is going, so as to ensure that academics are not only operating in ivory towers of intellectual self-service, but can demonstrate public engagement. As a working practitioner with Arts Council and other public funding for 40 years, arguing for social engagement of my work is nothing new. I make theatre after all, I need to reach audiences. Proving it, however, according to REF qualifiers, is a trickier challenge. It involves gathering testimonials, before and after evidence, and a range of other methods for answering that simple but knotty question, what changed? We produce impact case studies, and a great deal of labor and money is spent developing these with both internal and external advisors. Then, as creative practice researchers working in ephemeral arts, we are establishing our research value as compared to, for example, creating a vital change in human rights law or a scientific discovery that saves lives. We wryly comment today, as we work on REF 2021, that we're not exactly Oxford University producing the vaccine for COVID-19. Now that's impact. Our impacts will generally be rather on changing people's hearts and minds, on small shifts of organization or behavior. And this is far less easy to prove or evaluate in REF regulatory terms. Our government today is seeking to improve science, technology, engineering, and mathematics provision that are considered profitable and useful, while it construes the arts as well as social sciences and the humanities as low value. I'm quoting here, perhaps because these produce questioning citizens. Policy consistently undermines such disciplines in cultural as well as primary and secondary educational funding policy. In our current UK higher education landscape in which we've been effectively privatized, students are paying very high fees. The REF counts for a great deal. Income from government is determined by the scores, even though this forms a relatively small percentage of income overall. The REF value ascribed to a department and an institution is more reputational and economic, though with cascading economic effect. Quite simply, you don't get customers if you're not seen to provide excellent service. UK universities are operating in a highly competitive environment. In competing for students, we are beholden to all kinds of audits. A prospective student is searching for the best that money can buy, and this keeps us on our toes daily in an endless cycle of surveys and student satisfaction protocols. It is an understatement to say that the semi-privatization of our universities is corrupting the learning environment. It is frankly deleterious, and we feel the effect as it seeps down into the educational soil and infects the roots of our academies on a daily basis. Audits require mechanisms, measuring rods, standards, and all the vocabularies that go with data collection and proof. These are derived from science protocols, and this is why they sit uncomfortably with creative research. As co-director of our department's REF 2021 submission, 90% of my remit is taken up with justifying research within terminologies and quasi-scientific data collection that work against the very principle of creative research practice and its encounters with publics. Because culture isn't always a commodity whose effect can be instantly measured. Spectatorship isn't always consumerism that elicits pleasure or consolation or any other palpable, enjoyable benefit. Seeking to measure precisely the impact of an artistic experience derived from research is only ever going to be schematic. Sociologists have assessed and proved that the culture is good for you argument and perennially come up with useful evidence, such as that music is beneficial because it improves brain performance, and that drama socializes the child and can reduce anxiety, and so on. I was on a funding panel last year who awarded the substantial cash prize to a music researcher doing just this, since we're counteracting a government today that has drastically reduced arts learning in schools. My fundamental point is that using merely instrumental tools risks becoming a reducto ad absurdum for the impacts and effects of culture and the timelines along which these are felt, the small and large fireworks that ignite in a person's psyche and lived experience are impossible to package neatly into REF regulatory frameworks and any report to justify public spending. Meanwhile, gathering my practice research colleagues through the imperatives of this exercise in the production of their research portfolios, I find myself repeating, contre cœur, the REF mantra: this is a value judgment you're making, innovation you're claiming without evidence, they want the facts so they can assess the value. Or, This is a description, not a research question. They might throw up their hands and say, I know what happened, I was there, and I'm obliged to say, but did you capture that moment on video or audience questionnaire or some such? That's not to say that my colleagues aren't busy researching in the strict sense of addressing a problem by finding out new things. It's that they're researching according to their own terms of finding out, not the ref's, then straining to provide evidence in frames of reference with which they don't identify. Now, of course, there's an increased awareness of the imperative for evidence to justify funding. Today, archiving ephemeral practice as it happens is a correlative industry for the live practitioner, which, if you think about it, is a contradiction in terms. An artist trained in working to reach into the creative source, which can never be defined in absolutes, has to simultaneously be looking in their rearview mirror, gathering archive. Now there's a culture of brilliant websites for far less brilliant work, of course, another fallout from what Guy Debord called the society of the spectacle. For some, producing archival evidence comes easy. For others, it's an agony, not just in the sense of pain, but in the word's original meaning, a contest steeped in contradictory forces. On the other hand, as regards durable evidence of the ephemeral, contemporary practice can sometimes appear as if out of nowhere, without precedence or reference, reinventing an unknown wheel that has turned many years earlier, invisible to the younger practitioner. Such lacunae can arise simply due to access to history. Much 20th century innovation in my discipline occurred pre-video and digital recording. There is a paucity of evidence in, for example, the history of what we call alternative theatres in the UK. I'm working to address this on a project. We are at pains as educators to join the dots and assist our students in finding out what their heritage might be and how they are, even unwittingly and coincidentally, taking ideas of the past forward into the present and future. Again, performance studies can provide useful intellectual reference points to support locating an assumption of novelty into an historic context. Another twist to note, the ethos of performance research has created in turn examples of practice that can be something created entirely for the academic world to feed on, not performance for paying publics and the media, but performance inquiries that never produce an encounter with audience, nor have to prove themselves worthy of, say, public funding. Such work will not make a ref impact case study, but might go into a pack of research submissions. There's nothing intrinsically invalid with such research processes, for they might bring important new insights, another ref criterion, that will transmit and pass through the culture eventually. Only one can find a straining to prove, as if the university environment itself and all attendant critical theories encourage a kind of falsehood, an intellectualizing of activities that are frequently simpler, more obvious, and less opaque than any theoretical justification can sincerely substantiate. To conclude, ephemeral practice research means many things. As an artist practitioner and researcher who writes creatively as well as critically and theoretically, you may not be surprised that I remain skeptical of the ref exercise, not because I don't understand the need to justify public spending, but because I'm not sure the ref has found the right mechanism for this as regards creative arts research, because we're proving our value to society in a particular neoliberal political moment in the UK, a political move to the right started by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, who declared there was no such thing as society, only individuals. The word industry has seamlessly slipped into the arts vocabulary so that we now have cultural industries and not just culture. We have cultural entrepreneurship rather than cultural activity. The languages of the factory and business applied to creative arts are the new normal. This is the landscape of the cynic, whom the writer Oscar Wilde defined as someone who, quote, knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Reducing the value of creative practice to an instrumental measure and testing this against investment will remain distasteful to those who actually produce cultural knowledge. In the UK, this shift in values has occurred in my own adult lifetime. I started working professionally when the Arts Council was funding what it defined then as quality, not what rapidly under Thatcher became a bums on seats, that means audience numbers value system, box ticking, that has prevailed since. Universities have been slower to succumb to the market, but have done so perforce since the hefty hike in tuition fees in 2011, following swiftly on from post-2008 austerity politics. Today, our managers will tell us, acutely felt during COVID-19, we have nothing to prove other than our cost effectiveness. The REF, which presides over all UK research institutions, serves this ideology. What we can rescue from its negative effect on academic freedom and creative vigour is that at least it brings the opportunity for colleagues to discover each other's work in some detail and to re-establish our departmental identity and aims, and to focus on our common purpose. I speak of this in the midst of pandemic. Not only are theatres going bankrupt, but the UK government has caught higher education institutes in a double bind. We're privatised to the extent that at Goldsmith, for example, 75% of our income depends on fees, with some 9% on the public purse through Higher Education Funding Council that responds to REF results. This means that we continue to be defined as public sector institutions and not businesses that can benefit from the government's current subsidies to prop up the economy. Our futures depend on private bank loans and the dexterity of those who will survive within our universities to come up with recovery plans. These doubtlessly will include some of the learning that has shifted to online, as we've been learning, all of us, in the last couple of months. We can envisage, on the bright side, opportunity for closer collaboration beyond our borders for both our pedagogy and research futures. Entropy might not be totally reversed, but kept at bay if creative thinking in universities finds ways to duck and dive in what has in the UK become an obstacle course around which we navigate ways of avoiding some of the pitfalls of what is now termed a knowledge economy, in which our value is reduced to numbers on a scale. And so, finally, paradoxically, as theatre arts were brought into the university environment precisely to insist on their intrinsic value in a world of science, 70 years on, we continue to compete in and with this world to validate how we bring benefit. Creative research and pedagogy constitute a questioning relationship to society and in turn produce societal effect. We know this, but we continue to struggle to prove how ephemeral arts that leave memory rather than material trace and whose impact is so hard to monetize can generate thinking beyond frames, oppressions, and national borders. As we live through the current global pandemic and climate catastrophe and the likely economic crash that will follow, the imagination, as the situationist proclaimed back in 1968, will have to seize power because, quite simply, we're going to have to imagine really hard how to face the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. Yes, and now the floor is open. Comments, questions. Well, yeah, just a very short comment. I'm afraid, yes, we have just the same situation here, and our academia has been, reluctant and unwilling to support social science because, yes, of this very low value. And it seems like, yes, we're going through the same crisis in connection with the pandemic because everything is going online. And again, yes, it's all about, this hesitations, how valid online versus offline. So quite, yes, a combination of different things. But my question is about PhD by practice, which doesn't exist in Russian academia, as you perfectly know from us. Mm-hmm. But this is something, yes, we're willing to introduce, at least at our PhD school of art and design. And I know that even though the format was praised highly, and I know that you are one of the biggest advocates of the format, at the same time, I heard about some criticism towards it. So could you say a little bit about what are the major points which actually make some academic people, some scholars uncertain, unsure about the potential of this format in the UK?
Well, I think I even had a colleague in my own department saying there shouldn't be practice PhDs, they should be MFAs, because practice is not hard knowledge. I mean, we actually talk about hard skills and soft skills, which is very phallic terminology for knowledge, which really we need to change this knowledge, this terminology. So I think there is this idea deeply in certain scholars that you know, this is knowledge. A book is knowledge, you know, but an idea, an image, an object, a body performing is not knowledge. It's kind of, it belongs to something less tangible and less rigorous. So I think the idea has always been that perhaps artists don't think rigorously because they're using a different part of their brain. And that, so there's a lot of suspicion of this. And of course, there's a lot of research now into how mirror neurons work and how the brain is working and so on, and how we learn and how we use some of the things that artists assume are part of their vocabulary in any kind of being in the world and interpreting it. I think a lot of it is a fear. I mean, I think it's just a fear of the freedom that creative research brings. But I will also counter that with saying that, I don't know if you know this term, in English we say I have bullshit detector. I mean, there is a bullshit detector factor as well, because there can be a lot of almost pomposity that can come up when an artist is struggling to contextualize their practice that might have come from very different ways of thinking and operating in the world into a scholarly environment. And I think sometimes the languages, it's like what I was talking about, my choreographer, he was not being pompous, he was struggling. Mm-hmm. And I was helping him in the struggle because I thought that that's what they would want, is for him to demonstrate as a choreographer working in this training methodology. He was actually working on capturing a training methodology. He's a whirling dervish, a spinning dervish, and he wanted to create a methodology that could reproduce the state of mind when you spin, which he's done. Really hard to prove, really hard to prove. He proved it in a methodology that's now going global. But the theoretical apparatus he needed to prove that was really hard. So it wasn't that they were looking at the practice to prove, they were saying the practice proves it brilliantly. What's the writing doing to match that, to be, synchronous with that? And it's quite hard not to produce bullshit, because for an artist, it's quite obvious what you're doing, That's not to say that we think in facile ways, but it's the doing of the practice that contains the intellectual understanding. When you then have to separate off and articulate it, it can produce dissonance. So I think sometimes the critique is that the dissonance is the problem. And as I say, also prejudice against creative practice being in the universities anyway. I mean, in our country, like I was saying, the history of our country, it's quite late in the day, the very, very end of war period, New Britain, that the arts started to enter into higher education. I don't know when they came in Moscow, in Russia, but, we've got a very big art school at Goldsmiths, world-renowned. Effectively, it's an art school, it's a department, but it's a very, very reputable art school. It has a lot of issues. I'm just going to say one more anecdote about that. I went to a conference some years back, and the presentations were all about practice research, and a very provocative fine artist scholar gave a talk in which the entire PhD, there was no writing, there was just a kind of artist auto-curation statement. The entire PhD was a student making an enormous ball of string over 3 years. And it was argued as a kind of Zen practice. And I've never forgotten it because it was so radical and so crazy, but she managed to justify it.
Oh, right. It happens. Okay, thank you. Questions, comments?
I wanted to thank Anna, first of all, because it's actually invaluable what we heard from you. It's something we're at the beginning of, and you are very advanced. So behind, and you put a dilemma in front of us, whether we want to catch up or we want to withdraw. And nobody knows what to do in this situation. But I'm very sympathetic to your cry out of the heart. And I removed myself consciously from any institution. I'm very marginal because I don't have the strength, the hard skills to fight the formal structures of a Russian institution. We have a different history of integrating art into our academia, by the way, and which gives priority to the fine arts, not to the performative arts. And that's one part of the problem, that academics want to integrate art into the academia. They have to face this division, this really a cleavage between fine arts and performative arts. To the extent that we now, as Lyudmila should say, well, it's not for me to say, but we have the experts who they have to assess the performative practices, but the experts come from the fine art history, for example. The criteria is absolutely inappropriate. But I actually wanted to ask you a personal question. And you mentioned that you interpreted for Peter Brook in Paris. Mm-hmm. What was, can you tell us a bit more?
Oh, that was when I was very young. I mean, I was really young. It was in my, what we now call gap year. I gave up being a Royal Ballet dancer, and I took a year, went to Paris. I was very young. I knew nothing about theatre, and he was working in his research towards the Conference of the Birds tour of Africa. So the poet Ted Hughes was writing stories, and I had to translate them into French because one of the actors, Malik from Mali, didn't speak English. So I was there translating, but Peter let me join in certain things. So Moshe Feldenkrais came. I worked with Feldenkrais himself, which was amazing. And he used to fly in a Tai Chi teacher. So he let me watch all rehearsals, and then I'd go and do some translation. It was life-changing, absolutely life-changing, yeah. And in fact, I have had a long collaboration, and she's my closest friend now, with his sonographer, Sally Jacobs, whom I originally met at that time.
So Ed, thank you. I want to add that perhaps we're doing this because some of it is life-changing, and that's the real motive, the real engine behind.
Experiences can be life-changing.
We're trying to do. Thank you.
Can I pick up something you said, Irina, about you said about the kind of the performance as understood in a fine art practice and performance as understood in a dance or theatre. Of course, that tension exists today, even at Goldsmiths. So, you know, there was a time when there was someone teaching performance at Goldsmiths Department of Art, and I couldn't make a bridge with them. And I have students who come onto my MA performance making program from fine art, and we always have to negotiate the difference of what and they're allowed, my students can put up fine art performance within my program. What they have to do is identify that they're doing that. They have to say, this is my heritage. So we'll say, we look at your work through this lens, this lens, this lens. If your work is coming from fine art, we have to understand the reference points for that, because they're different, because they have different representational, potentially different representational origins, although I think there's a big hybrid mix at the moment, because representation itself is so contested. But it's an ongoing problem. Yeah. Not problem, challenge, yeah.
Yes, it is challenge. I face with it every day.
Do you?
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah.
Yes.
Dear Anna, thank you for your speech. It already sounded like a manifesto to me. As long as you mentioned many manifestos from the 60s. I just wanted to say that I was deeply touched by the case of your student who had this experience of losing her practice or his practice while being in research of it, in a theoretical research. And well, I'm a bit of in the same situation. So my basic interest is in how do people structure their schedules, let's say, their studies and research practices in order to combine it somehow, because it seems like a hard struggle, because you are left out either out of practice or out of theory. So it's kind of a play when you have to sit on both chairs and you always fall and miss. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing this.
Do you have a video? Can I see your face to talk to you? Or is that possible? I can't.
It's more possible.
Hi. I think it's hugely problematic, and it's like, how do you structure your time? Because I know myself that when I've just written a book, you know, I needed to just do that. I couldn't have made new work at the same time very easily. You know what I mean? I think that sometimes we know that we need this brain for this and this brain for this. And I don't think there's no set plan for how you do the praxis job. In fact, my student, we just had a Skype this week. She's just rescued her practice very cleverly. She's just managed to find a way, but it's been like dragging her. And she was someone who was terrified of theory. And she became completely excited and engrossed by it. She just loved it so much. And I kept saying, where's your practice? She said, oh, I can't do it. I can't do it. I don't know how to do it because I haven't found out what it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. I just wanted to thank you for mentioning it. And I also know that Tatiana Gordeeva is here, and she is, to my point of view, the most cleverest combiner of theory and practice in such a way in performance arts. So yeah, somehow, while during my studies in Vaganova, we managed it somehow, but it was on MA level. I was doing my master's in choreography, but within PhD, and you also mentioned it, that it's better for some artists to do masters than be MFA than become a PhD, because being a PhD requires more theory than just the lower level of institutional appropriation. So
I think that's sad. In a way, that's very sad, because I think PhDs should accommodate creative practitioners. But I think that's the thing. What I say to my master's students is that we write for different audiences, you know. So when you write a research statement, which they all write for their practice, they're writing to an academic audience. That doesn't mean that when they write to a public saying, come to my performance, they're going to write differently about it. The work itself is not necessarily going to contain the research theoretically. I mean, the theory of the research. The theory can be a way of stepping out and looking at what you've made. It's not, I don't think the practice is always an expression of the theory. And I don't think artists work like that. I think we work by filling ourselves up with all kinds of ideas, including theoretical research perhaps, but I don't make work from theory. I make work from what goes on in my back of my brain, but from a kind of, it's like you fill up your brain with the petrol it needs. But I think it's a really problematic idea, because I think some of the research practice that I've seen that comes from a highly theoretical, rather kind of literal theoretical interpretation can be not as interesting. It can be much more solipsistic. Whereas the research that really has the artistic drive in it, that then can be supported and talk to its own theoretical reflexivity, I think is more successful. But that's not an absolute either. I say these things and they don't necessarily apply to everyone.
I think there is no a recipe for everyone. I think it's always some, you know, just kind of individual work, because there definitely should be both creative drive and theoretical drive.
Yes.
Because yes, if you don't have it, you won't be able to do a theoretical PhD either.
Also, I think that there's, I don't know if you have this, but there's a big movement towards art writing now within the academic environment. And art writing is much more the artist manifesto writing. And one of my external examiners really wanted me to shift the final reflexive essay that my students write at master's level into a piece of art writing. I've actually held on to the critical, you know, the normal, more traditional essay, because they only get to write 2 papers the whole year. And I think that supports them better for their future. Because art writing can be very brilliant, but it can be an excuse for a lack of intellectual rigor as well in less experienced people.
Right.
I just think that there is a kind of a problem that appears when it comes to theory, what you named as a bullshit detector, because for less let's say rigorous people, it is quite it becomes name dropping afterwards.
Yes.
And it makes no sense, because as an artist you draw your way into the institution by name dropping, but it doesn't make any impact to the culture afterwards, because it has no sense in it.
Yes.
But it institutionalizes you perfectly in a way.
But I think if we think about creative practice, you're a dancer, choreographer, you're a dancer?
Yes.
I'm a choreographer.
So presumably when you go into studio, you have a question. I mean, I think creative practice, unless you are doing very conservatoire work of repeating a classical idiom and just perfecting that ballet bar or whatever it is you're doing, as soon as you are making, you have a question in that studio. And that's not so different from sitting at a desk and having a research question that you're writing and thinking about. It's kind of, it's valorizing the question, it's recognizing the question that goes into that studio, I guess, rather than the impulse. My problem is that I've been highly trained in improvisation, which is all about being in the present moment and literally getting rid of, you know, all the work I did with Grotowski was about getting rid of the front brain and the critic and the you know, the kind of the analytical brain, and just being very, very spontaneous. You know, and a lot of dance practitioners and theatre makers who are creating their own work need that spontaneity, need that kind of rejection of the analytic brain. But like Ludmila says, I mean, there's no kind of model. There's no, I think each PhD has to find its own path. But I would say to you, I would hate to abandon the idea of creative PhDs because they can't support genuinely the creativity of the student.
We are working on it. We are working on it. Yes. Yeah. Trying really hard.
Do you have candidates coming up now? Do you have?
Well, Alena is one of our PhD students, actually. Yes. And it's her PhD, which, yes,
she's setting
quite a lot of questions. Yes. I mean, in connection with PhD by practice. Yes, we have quite a lot of PhD candidates at the moment. There are around 30, but yes, not all of them are into practice-based PhDs. No, mostly theory. But we would like to actually to provide both, because for creative area, I think it's important.
And is your word length similar to ours for practice? 30 to 50,000?
We don't have practice. We have only theory PhDs, and it's the amount for theory only thesis.
I see. I understand.
Yes.
I thought you were saying that some will practice already. No, not at all.
No, no. This is why Irina said we are at the very beginning of this road. So it's important that yes, we have such talks, and thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. We have 2 minutes left. If there is any comments or questions, colleagues, friends, please join in.
I can see Roger raising hand.
Roger, yes, I can see you raising hand. Please.
Oh, very briefly, I would like to thank Anna. Her talk was extremely wide-ranging, and I greatly admire the ability to hold together the political engagement with at the institutional level with creative thinking. This is wonderful. I myself can't really comment on what's going on because I'm outside the system like Irina. And it seems to me enormously privileged to be outside the system in certain ways. But it's not privileged in the sense that one works in a great deal of isolation. That is, that there isn't impact if you're outside the system. So you're caught both ways. I have a great deal of experience in examining PhDs, theoretical, and I would certainly, and I'm very interested in the idea that it can be done differently from the way in which I've done it. And what I would say is, it seems to me you have to be very sensitive to context. There are different languages, there are different practices for different purposes. And that clearly there is a theoretical, philosophical, academic purpose which should be sustained. At the same time, there's no earthly reason why you can't do other things for other reasons. In fact, we do this all the time in our everyday lives. And it is simply it's not simply, it's the inertia of academic tradition on the one hand, and it's the situation in which Britain is in and Russia is in. It's the overwhelming pressure of finding criteria which can satisfy bureaucratic practices, which push against, which shape the context. And what Anna so wonderfully illustrated was a set of ways in which it's possible to find other contexts and other languages appropriate, even within this framework. And so, well, let me express my admiration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I mean, I think that I'm fascinated to hear that you're in Russia going through such similar kind of issues. I think we feel quite beleaguered in the UK because of what's going on politically. We think we're the only ones suffering from these kind of instrumental agendas and these kind of things that are really affecting higher education. It's very frightening because I think we know globally things are blowing up in so many ways. It's no coincidence, perhaps, that the very kind of centers of creative and critical thinking in higher education are the most vulnerable. I mean, that's why I used the word ephemeral in the title. And when Glyn Wickham was bringing in post-war this idea of a difficult topic into the academy, and then it was like a quasi-drama school. It wasn't really quite like that at all. It was more intellectual, but and here we are back in the same problem, really, where if we're not producing cures, I mean, even science, though, is feeling vulnerable in the UK at the moment, I would say. But don't let me go off on a tangent there about our current climate. It's just very interesting to hear the resonances. And there's lots of hard work to do because universities, I don't know what you're going through economically with the pandemic, but we are in serious financial trouble at the moment, which is a way of the wrong forces. It gives opportunity for the wrong forces to take root even more deeply in the learning environment. But our students are wonderful. They're not going to stop asking questions.
Yeah, well, yes, let's see how it goes. And I hope that our lab, Space Body Spectator, will actually start to work. And those who are interested, you are welcome to join us, and more information to follow in some time.
That would be wonderful. And it would be lovely to have a follow-up with you very soon, because I've got some things to report, and I just want to share this book with you all. I'll give you the title. This has been a very helpful book for us all, written by a head of creative research in one of the theatre schools. It's just a very useful summary of PhDs and creative practice research.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. Anna, thank you so much. It's wonderful, yes, having you here with us today. And of course, we hoped you would come to Moscow, but at least, yes, we are all together in this space.
On the other side, as we're saying.
Yeah, okay, there will be a chance. Thank you so much. And okay.
And I look forward to the dialogue continuing in the ways we're planning.
Yes, we will. Yes, next week. Hopefully. Yes, right. Let's plan it. Okay, goodbye. And
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.